During Rosh Hashanah, we read two phenomenal and very difficult stories about parents and children. The first is the story of the birth of Isaac and the expulsion of Abraham's first son, Ishmael, and his mother Hagar. On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, we read the Akedah, the story of the binding and near sacrifice of Isaac. These are two stories that rabbis don't always like to talk about because they're so difficult. On the other hand, how fascinating is it that at the center of our tradition are such challenging stories and to be read during the high holidays? One tells of a father who expels a child because of the birth of another child, Isaac. And the other where a father almost sacrifices that same child, Isaac, to God. These stories, of course, raise endless questions and induce endless commentaries. But don't worry, this is not an endless sermon. Instead, I want to talk about one small sliver of these stories, which is that what it is that parents do to their children. After all, many of us are parents, and we are all children. I'll begin with Freud, who, as you may know, tells the story of what children want to do to their parents. And it's called the Oedipal complex. Well, in 1955, a psychiatrist, Eric Wellish, wrote a book called Isaac and Oedipus, a study in biblical psychology, in which he said that had Freud spent more time with the Torah and less time with Greek mythology, he would have written about the Isaac complex and about how the way in which sometimes parents destroy their children, as opposed to the way in which children destroy their parents. And I want to talk about both. But let's take the word destroy out for a minute because they were talking about epic stories. I just want to talk about our lives. And the first thing I want to point out here is along with the love and the dreams and the hopes and the closeness and nice feelings that are between parents and children, there's also a lot of anger. First of all, for those of you who are children, when you came along, you placed severe restrictions on your parents' lives. There are lots of things we parents couldn't do anymore, like go out when we wanted to go out and come home when we want to come home, or go out to a movie that isn't animated, or spend time with friends. We can't do that much anymore. And we can't spend money on ourselves as much anymore because one day you're going to go to college and suck our savings dry. We know that about you. Now, if we were perfect people, we'd react to this with equanimity and kindness and goodness, and pleased that we have no money left to spend on things we want, and pleased we can't do what we want when we want to do it. But we're not perfect. And the truth is that it can tick us off a bit from time to time. And for parents, you have to do what you can to remember how hard it is to live in someone else's house, who's always telling you what to do, watching you over your shoulder. And even when they don't actually tell you what to do, the look on their face tells you what to do, and that's enough pressure. And you may remember the day you left your parents' house, which has affinities with another biblical story about Moses and the Exodus, because it was like a liberation. Although in today's world, there's a new phenomenon, sociological phenomenon, when they leave for college and they come back and live with you until they're 35. So maybe next year's sermon. And that tension between parent and child, even in the most loving relationship, is constant and it's real. And part of the function of those Torah stories is to bring out tensions that we don't express for ourselves. I mean, granted, every parent and every child know these things are true. The tensions are there, which is why parents at times say things to children that they don't really mean, such as, "You're never allowed to leave this house again. As long as I live, not another dollar will I give you." And why is that? Because in the moment, you're in the grip of the Isaac complex. And I want to focus on, for this Yom Kippur, about something that many children may not realize that their parents have to do that makes the life of parents particularly difficult, and what parents often neglect to do. That is, almost every parent says some version of this to their child. I want you to be whatever kind of person you want to be. This is a total lie. We don't mean that when we say it. What we actually mean is, we want you to be whatever kind of person you want to be, within the limits of what we think is a good and worthy person. That's what we really mean. And I can tell you that I can remember quite specifically a couple of conversations that I had with my father about what I should do when I grew up, and he would say, whatever you want. You know what? He was full of it. Totally lying. Because I know that if I came home one day and said, you know, given all of the possible professions out there for me, when I grow up, I've concluded that collecting garbage is my true calling and it will give me the greatest satisfaction. I am 100% certain that my parents would never have said, how wonderful that it is that you found your calling in life's work. Because as parent, you do have dreams for your children, and there are things that you do want them to be, and things that you think they should be. You can't help it. But here's the kicker. In order to raise a child to certain values and ideals for themselves, you, as a parent, have to model them. And that's what's really hard. Think about it like this. One day, your child comes home and says something foul, and you angrily ask, where on earth did you hear that? Guess where? From you. You say it all the time. And in that moment, you realize that if you want something from the person you are raising, you yourself have to be what it is you want from them. And that's one of the things that makes the parent-child relationship both beautiful and difficult. Because all of a sudden, as a parent, when you have a child, now you have to be that which you claim you want them to be. And this brings us to Judaism. That is to say, if you want your child to have a Jewish life, be a part of the Jewish people, but you don't come to synagogue, you don't do any Jewish study, well, they know that. If you constantly prioritize everything else over Jewish engagement and attendance, they're learning the lesson you are teaching them. If you want your child to care about their people, to give tzedakah to our people, but you don't give tzedakah, and when at times that you do, it's not to Jewish causes. You want your child not to speak ill of others, to not talk Lashon Hara, but you talk Lashon Hara on the phone with your friends. If they never see you express Jewish solidarity, if they never see you go to a soup kitchen or home for the elderly, but all of a sudden you think it's a good idea if they do for a bar bat mitzvah project to seemingly check a box on their resume, the messages are loud and clear. This is one of the things that makes parenting so difficult. You can't just say to your kid, you should be this way. Because children are heat-seeking missiles to hypocrisy. Because when you tell them you should be this way, they think to themselves, yeah, I get you have to say that as a parent, Dad. But I've lived in this house for years, and that's not what you do, so why should I? Here's the bottom line. Parenting should make us better people, not more hypocritical people. If we talk about the values that we hold, and then all of a sudden we awaken to the reality that we are actually supposed to be the model for those values, well then we might have to change our lives a bit to regularly demonstrate those values. And this, by the way, doesn't have to be seen as a challenge to having a child. We should think of it as an inspiration, a motivation. If it makes you better, then it's not just good for you, but it's also good for your children and the people around you. Because children are mirrors. Actually, they're not exactly mirrors. They're more like funhouse carnival mirrors. They don't reflect you exactly, perfectly, not entirely, but they reflect you enough that when you look at them, you know it's you. And you can see that that's what you taught, that's what you said, and that's what you neglected to do. And that's part of the joy, but to be perfectly honest, also part of the hostility that many parents feel toward children. It's like your children are just as much looking over your shoulder as you are theirs. And so there's times as a parent when you kind of want to let loose a little and you say, we want to do this. But let's be honest, if we do this, our kids might see, and then they'll think it's okay, and then they'll want to do it, and that's bad, and we don't want that. Guess we're not doing that. And in that subtle way, our children are our spiritual teachers, as we are to them. And that is why Judaism places such an incredible, immense emphasis on the way you educate your child. The Shema, the central declaration of Jewish faith, says, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might, and these words which I command you this day shall be on your heart. And then immediately afterward, when it's telling you of the values that are to be central to your life, the next phrase is, Veshinantam levanecha, you shall teach them to your children. Now why? Partly because if you teach them to your children will know them. But it's so much more than that, because if you teach them to your children, you have to model them yourself. It works both ways. It's synergistic. I'll give you an example. I studied Jewish thought and Jewish philosophy for many, many years. You want to know when I learned it? When I started teaching it to kids, teens, adults, graduate students. All of a sudden, when I was teaching students, I really had to know the material. Knowing it well enough to pass the test and then forget it forever wasn't good enough when you have to teach it to others. Students, children, adults ask questions, often unexpected ones, and you have to know it deeply enough within yourself and understand it well enough to explain it concisely in your own words. Same as parenting. You learn it when you teach it. So if you want to raise a Jewish child, you have to live a Jewish life. If you don't, believe me, and I've seen it thousands of times, it just doesn't work. The odds are so heavily stacked against them growing up to live a Jewish life. Now, I should add one caveat, that even if you do live a Jewish life, it's true, there's no 100% guarantee it'll work. One of the remarkable, beautiful, and infuriating things about children is that one day they grow up to become their own people. So you can tell them the same thing every day of their life, and one day they can still turn around and say, you know, I don't believe that, I'm going to do it a different way. But, and this is a big but, your only chance, your only real shot of bringing someone into the wonderful, communal, loving world of our Jewish tradition and our people is if you're a part of it, involved in it. I think of that same tension between Abraham and Isaac, unimaginable after Abraham almost kills him. But remarkably enough, even though the story is so disturbing, so difficult, it turns out that through Isaac and at least one of his children, and Isaac's sons, Jacob, Isaac produces somebody who creates the nation of Israel. So despite all the instability, the psychological trauma, something about Isaac's home, something about Abraham and Sarah as parents, something implanted in him, the recognition that this message, this people, this tradition was so profoundly important that his parents lived it, that they prioritized it, transmitted it, and it became his own. So at this point in the sermon, you must realize that as I say all of this about parents and children, I'm not just speaking of parents and children in the conventional sense, of merely parents of small children or teens. The truth is, or if our children already, that we're all modeling Jewish adults to children. And you may also realize that as I say all this, I do so with data about Jews in America in mind. In that regard, the good news is that the Jewish population in America is staying steady. According to Pew Research polls, we're not shrinking. But the flip side of that, bad news is that Jewish engagement, Jewish affiliation, Jewish educational knowledge, Jewish participation is all on the decline. The fastest growing Jewish demographic, and I love this phraseology, is, quote, Jews of no religion. I love this phraseology because it's supposed to be broader than secular Jew or non-observant Jew. These are terms I understand. And therefore, I literally have no idea what Jew of no religion means. In any event, what this data ultimately points to is that young Jews are growing up to do less and less Jewish things. Their Judaism and even their Jewish identity, it isn't thick, it isn't resilient, it isn't committed. It's like there's a generation, maybe generations of Jews who think that if they've watched a TikTok video about Hanukkah or the Star of David, maybe they have attended a Passover Seder in the past 2 years, or they put in an hour at a Rosh Hashanah service, that their Jewish education and identity is complete. It's obviously not. If you don't know anything about Jewish history, the relations between Christians and Muslims and Jews in the Middle Ages, if you don't know what the Talmud is, if you've never wrestled with texts with our great medieval rabbis, such as Rashi, Maimonides, Nachmanides, learning how to question and debate, which is the cornerstone of Jewish spirituality, by the way, and incidentally, also civil discourse. If you haven't learned any of that, then what value is there to Jewish thought and spirituality? And how on earth are you going to respond to anti-Semitism? To quote author Sarah Hurwitz, speaking on this exact point, she says, quote, if someone tells you Judaism is violent and vengeful with an angry, hateful God, and it's not spiritual, and you know nothing about the Jewish tradition, what are you going to say? Oh boy, I love Seinfeld? If someone tells you Israel is a settler colonialist enterprise, and you haven't studied the history of Israel and Zionism, are you going to be like, my bubby makes good kugel. I really like tikkun olam. What are you going to say? End quote. And so although the data indicates our numbers aren't shrinking in America, we sure are shrinking on Jewish content. Yale professor Adil Pinker points this out in his analysis of the Pew data, basically saying that it's really just a number shell game. In other words, American Jews will continue to statistically replenish themselves, who identify nominally as, quote, partly Jewish, but they're not really participating in Jewish life. And their children and eventual grandchildren participate even less and less in diminishing returns. We're growing nominally partly Jews, not deep, not knowledgeable, not committed Jews. And please believe me, that you don't have to be Orthodox to maintain strong identification rates and consistent numbers. There's a darn good philosophical and ethical reason that I, as a conservative Jew and rabbi, that we, as a conservative synagogue, believe and trust we represent the best and definitively most authentic stream of Judaism. And I've seen plenty of conservative Jews demonstrate the strong value of Jewish commitment and raise their children with it. And I would just like to see more of it, especially with the state of the world today. Lastly, I want to tell you a story, one that you may have heard. And it sums this up in an extraordinary way. It's a story, really, that every Jewish parent should know. You know, during the Second World War, a lot of Jewish children were either given up by their parents or simply lost to their parents. Many of those kids ended up being raised in monasteries all across Europe. In fact, you may know that Abraham Foxman, the former head of the Anti-Defamation League, was raised in a Catholic monastery during the war. But Jews weren't the only children raised in those monasteries. Catholic monasteries took in war orphans from all across Europe. And so Jews and Christians were raised in the monastery together. And obviously, they were subject to the same religious teachings, religious rituals, values, food. They took the same classes, the same everything. Which meant that after the war, nobody knew who was a Jewish child and who was a Christian child, because so many had come in so young, and after 6 years of living in a monastery and absorbing Christian life, how could you know? I mean, if you came in at 3 and now you're 9, who knew that they were a Jewish child? And so the Jewish people were facing an additional tragedy on top of this tragedy of kids lost their parents, which that not only would they never be restored to their families, but they'd also never know that they were actually Jews. And then someone came up with a brainstorm as to how to identify Jewish children. They sent shlichim, messengers, emissaries throughout all of Europe, and asked them to gather up all the children that were sent as war orphans to the monasteries. And the emissaries would walk up and down the lines of children at these monasteries, and they'd say, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And the children who were able to join in, or who could finish it for them, because they'd sung it with their parents night after night before the war, the children who knew it, the ones who could finish it, the emissaries knew were Jewish children. So I want to say that every Jewish parent should say the Shema at their child's bed at night. Not just because of the power of that story and how it reminds us that certain bonds are unbreakable when you forge them, but also because you give your child a legacy forever. What child in old age, and God willing, all of our children will reach old age, won't be affected, won't remember that their mother, their father prayed with them every day of their life? And that means you have to do it. That means there's a restriction on the freedom of the parent. You have a nightly commitment. But after all, it's part of what love is. Love is a freedom and it's a restriction. Love is defined by doing certain things and not doing other things. But I have no doubt that those children and their parents, no matter where they were grateful that night after night they prayed, they managed to overcome the impulse of wanting to do whatever it is they wanted to do, because they knew that you can't raise a Jewish child, you can't raise a faithful child, a child responsible and committed to our people, a caring, good child, unless you are yourself a Jewish, faithful, responsible, and committed parent to our people. And so in the end, our children are here in the world for themselves. They're really as much or probably even more God's children than they are ours. But also a little bit they're ours, and here for us too. And I hope that they hear our prayers. They see our goodness. They see how much our people and this wise tradition make us better people. And one day I hope and pray that they are blessed with children themselves, as we have been, and that they carry on our tradition as Abraham's child did, as Isaac's child did with Jacob, which is in fact why we are all here today in the first place. Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova. May it be a healthy, sweet year. May we all be sealed for goodness and life. Amen.